They mocked her the moment she stepped into the courtroom. To them, she was nothing more than a child playing pretend, a defendant who had no business standing up for herself. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't even begin to suspect, was that she had come prepared to shatter every expectation. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with whispers that blended into a low hum. It was the kind of crowd you'd expect for a high-profile case, not a routine hearing. Lawyers, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the wooden benches, leaning in as if they already knew how this would play out. At the center of it all stood a young black girl, no older than 16. She wore a plain blue dress and scuffed sneakers that squeaked slightly against the polished floor. She didn't fidget, didn't shuffle nervously like someone accused of a serious crime. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. But Judge Richard Calloway wasn't impressed. He sat back in his chair, his robe draped over his bulky frame like it had been thrown on at the last second. Peering down at her over the rim of his glasses, he smirked, a slow, amused curl of the lips. "Miss Carter," he drawled, stretching out her last name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Do you even understand what you're being accused of?" The murmurs died instantly. Every eye darted between the judge and the girl. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink under his gaze or fumble for words the way he clearly expected. Instead, she met his stare with quiet confidence and answered, "Yes, Your Honor, I do." The judge let out a scoff, leaning forward now, as if she had just said something ridiculous. His voice dripped with condescension. "You sure about that?" he said. "Because this isn't some high school debate club, young lady. You're in a court of law." Laughter rippled through the crowd, short, sharp, and cruel. For the first time, she let her eyes sweep the room. Most of them were older, polished, suited. Their expressions were hard, judgmental. They looked at her like she was a spectacle, not a person. She let them look. There was something in her gaze, something unreadable, something just beneath the surface that hinted she knew more than they did. But Judge Calloway wasn't done yet. "I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to let you speak on your own behalf," he continued, waving a dismissive hand. "This isn't child's play. You're not equipped for this." Her lips parted slightly, almost as if she might respond, but then she closed them again, a faint smile creeping onto her face. The gallery shifted, sensing something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The judge took her silence as a sign of weakness and smirked. "That's what I thought." But what he didn't realize, what no one in that room realized, was that they weren't dealing with some scared teenager caught up in the system. She wasn't here by accident. She was here for a reason. And by the end of this hearing, they were all going to find out why. The judge tapped his pen against the desk, sharp, deliberate. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, flipping through the file in front of him. "Prosecution, you may proceed." A tall man with neatly combed hair and a gleaming gold watch rose from his chair, Assistant District Attorney Michael Sterling. He exuded confidence, strolling to the center of the room like he had already won. He shot a glance at the teenager, his smirk almost a mirror of the judge's. "Your Honor," he began, pacing slowly, "this is an open and shut case. The evidence speaks for itself." He continued, his voice smooth and practiced, presenting a well-rehearsed argument as though the girl wasn't even there. The defendant, a minor, was found at the scene in possession of. Objection. Her voice sliced through the room like a blade, calm, measured, and completely unexpected. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. The gallery stirred, whispers swelled like a rising tide. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Objection?" he repeated, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Miss Carter, do you even know what that means?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied smoothly, unfazed. "The prosecution is making assumptions about my intent without providing context. That's speculative, inadmissible." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Sterling faltered for the first time, his mouth tightening as he glared at her like she had just ruined his perfectly crafted argument. "Your Honor," he said, regaining his composure, "this is highly irregular." "No," she countered, her voice unwavering. "What's irregular is the lack of actual evidence tying me to any criminal activity." The judge's gavel slammed down, a sharp crack against the wood. "That's enough," he snapped, his face growing redder by the second. "Miss Carter, you are here to defend yourself, not play lawyer. One more outburst like that and I'll hold you in contempt. Her expression didn't waver. Understood, Your Honor. Sterling cleared his throat, shooting her a glare before turning back to the judge. Permission to approach the bench. I'd like to approach as well. The entire courtroom gasped. Judge Calloway stared at her, irritation flickering into disbelief. You don't get to make demands in my courtroom, he barked. I'm not making a demand, she corrected him. I'm exercising my right to present a fair defense. She took a step forward, and for the first time, the judge hesitated, because for the first time he was starting to realize this girl wasn't who he thought she was. A heavy silence hung in the courtroom, thick with tension. Judge Calloway's fingers tapped idly against the bench, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Olivia Carter stood firm, her gaze steady. The Assistant District Attorney, Michael Sterling, wasn't nearly as composed. His jaw clenched as he glared at her, his perfect courtroom script crumbling in real time. Your Honor, he began again, attempting to salvage control. This is highly irregular. No, Olivia interrupted, her voice sharp but measured. What's irregular is the lack of legitimate evidence tying me to any criminal activity. The judge's gavel slammed down. That's enough. His voice was edged with irritation, his patience clearly thinning. Miss Carter, you are here to defend yourself, not to play lawyer. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. But Olivia remained unfazed. Understood, Your Honor. Sterling exhaled, straightening his tie as if resetting his composure. As I was saying, permission to approach the bench. Olivia cut in again, her voice unwavering. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Judge Calloway's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Irritation? Intrigue? He studied her, his lips pressing into a thin line. You don't get to make demands in my courtroom, he snapped. I'm not making a demand, Olivia countered smoothly. I'm exercising my right to present a fair defense. But if you refuse to hear me out, I'll be forced to file a motion for recusal on the grounds of judicial bias. The room fell into stunned silence. Judge Calloway inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his gavel. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face, as if he wasn't sure whether to be furious or impressed. You think you're clever, don't you? He muttered. A slight smile tugged at Olivia's lips. Fine, he said finally. Approach. The courtroom held its breath as Olivia stepped forward, the weight of countless stares pressing against her. But if she felt it, she didn't show it. She placed a stack of neatly prepared documents on the judge's bench, sliding them forward with steady hands. This, she said, her voice even, is a preliminary review of the prosecution's evidence. Judge Calloway's brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. Sterling, still standing beside the prosecution's table, looked ready to explode. Your Honor, this is absurd. She can. Calloway cut him off without looking up. He scanned the documents, his frown deepening with each page. Where did you get this? I prepared it, Olivia replied simply. The judge's eyes flicked up to meet hers. And how exactly does a 16-year-old know how to do this? For the briefest moment, Olivia hesitated. Then she said, I read. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Judge Calloway leaned back, still flipping through her notes. His expression shifted, less dismissive, more calculating. He was searching for something, a flaw, a loophole, anything that would allow him to dismiss her. But there wasn't one. Every argument she had made, every point she had written, was airtight. Sterling, less composed than the judge, shook his head in frustration. Your Honor, this is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. She's a child. This isn't a debate club. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes remained locked on Olivia, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Who are you really? He asked. The question cut through the tension like a blade. Olivia exhaled, scanning the room before finally returning her gaze to the judge. I'm someone who understands the law better than most people in this room, she said, and I'm here to prove it. The gallery stirred, whispers turning into quiet murmurs. Sterling scoffed. Is that so? He sneered. Then why don't you explain exactly how you intend to do that? Olivia didn't hesitate. Let's start with Exhibit B, she said, turning toward the screen where the prosecution's evidence was displayed. The surveillance footage. Sterling folded his arms. The footage clearly shows you at the scene. Yes, Olivia agreed, nodding slightly. It shows someone who looks like me near the scene, but what you failed to mention, intentionally or not, is that the timestamp on the footage is missing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Judge Calloway frowned. Is that true? Sterling's mouth opened, then closed. The footage is reliable, he insisted. Is it? Olivia pressed, tilting her head. Because I have a forensic analyst report that outlines all the inconsistencies in the file. May I submit it to the court? The judge hesitated, then gestured for her to proceed. As Olivia handed over the document, she could feel the energy in the room shifting. Doubt was creeping in. People were starting to believe her. But before we continue, let's pause for a second. What would you do if no one took you seriously? If the system, whether in school, work, or life, was built to doubt you? Olivia is fighting against more than just a criminal charge. She's battling perception, bias, and expectation. This isn't just a story. It's a reflection of real life. How often do we judge people based on appearances? How often do we assume that youth means inexperience, that silence means ignorance? Maybe you've been in Olivia's position. Maybe you've been underestimated. What did you do? And more importantly, how did you prove them wrong? Let me know in the comments. Now back to the story. Judge Calloway flipped through the forensic report, his frown deepening. Sterling shifted uncomfortably. This raises serious concerns, the judge muttered. Olivia took a step back, her voice unwavering. And that's just the beginning. The courtroom was no longer just watching a trial. They were watching a reckoning. Judge Calloway's expression darkened with every page he turned. His fingers gripped the forensic report, the paper crinkling under the pressure. Across the courtroom, Michael Sterling sat stiffly, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle in his cheek twitched. This raises serious concerns, the judge muttered under his breath. Olivia Carter remained still, her hands resting on the defense table. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smiling, she was waiting. Calloway finally looked up, pinning Sterling with a hard stare. Mr. Sterling, can you explain this? Sterling exhaled sharply through his nose. He grabbed the report from the bailiff, flipping through the pages as if willing the inconsistencies to vanish. His lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecution maintains that the surveillance footage is reliable, he said, though the usual confidence in his voice had wavered. Even if there are minor discrepancies, the footage still places the defendant at the scene. Olivia spoke before the judge could respond. Minor discrepancies? She arched an eyebrow. The missing timestamp, the questionable chain of custody, and the documented alterations in the footage's metadata are not minor. They call into question the entire integrity of the evidence. Calloway turned back to Sterling. Is there an authenticated copy of this footage? Sterling hesitated. Not at this time, Your Honor. A hushed murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge leaned forward. Then until such a copy can be provided, Exhibit B is inadmissible. Sterling's face turned a deep shade of red. He inhaled sharply, visibly reining in his frustration. Your Honor, with all due respect, dismissing that footage doesn't erase the other evidence we've presented. Olivia tilted her head slightly, as if inviting him to continue digging his own grave. He took the bait. Let's move on to Exhibit D, the defendant's written confession. The moment he said it, Olivia reached for another document on her table. The so-called confession? She said. You mean the one I allegedly signed after being interrogated for hours without legal representation present? Sterling's jaw tightened. You were advised of your rights. No, I wasn't, Olivia countered smoothly. And even if I had been, the confession would still be inadmissible under federal law. I was 16 at the time, a minor. My request for an attorney was ignored. She held up the document she had retrieved, a signed affidavit from a civil rights attorney detailing the violations in her case. This is a sworn statement from a legal expert confirming that my rights were violated during questioning, which means, Your Honor, that Exhibit D must also be thrown out. Calloway's eyes skimmed the affidavit. He didn't look pleased, but it wasn't Olivia he was displeased with. Mr. Sterling? The judge prompted. Sterling ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, clearly struggling to maintain composure. This is absurd, he muttered. Your Honor. She what? Olivia interjected. Knows the law? Knows her rights? Sterling slammed a fist against the table. This entire case is turning into a spectacle. The gallery erupted into whispers again. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Someone near the back murmured, She's dismantling them piece by piece. Judge Calloway sighed heavily. He looked at Olivia, then at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," he said, rubbing his temple, "you brought this case to trial, and now 2 of your key pieces of evidence have been successfully challenged. Do you have anything left to present?" Sterling's lips parted, but he didn't speak. A long pause. Then reluctantly he sat down. "I have nothing further, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed with astonishment. Olivia remained composed, but her grip on the table tightened slightly. Judge Calloway exhaled and turned to her. "Well, Miss Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, "you've certainly made your case." Olivia straightened. "Then, Your Honor, I respectfully move for an immediate dismissal of all charges." Another wave of murmurs. Sterling sat stiffly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair like he was physically restraining himself from arguing further. Calloway tapped his gavel once, calling for order. Then he studied Olivia again, as if truly seeing her for the first time. A 16-year-old girl, a defendant who had outmaneuvered a seasoned prosecutor, someone who had forced an entire courtroom to rethink everything they thought they knew. He let out a slow breath. "The court will take a brief recess before I issue my final ruling," he announced. A mixture of frustration and relief rippled through the room. Olivia nodded once, stepping back as the courtroom erupted into conversation. Reporters rushed toward the exits, no doubt racing to publish breaking headlines. As Olivia turned to gather her papers, a shadow loomed over her table. It was Sterling. "You think you've won?" he muttered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Olivia glanced up at him, unbothered. "I think the truth won." His eyes darkened, but he said nothing else. He turned sharply and stormed out of the courtroom. Olivia exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the polished wood of the table. She had spent so long fighting, proving that she wasn't just another name in the system, that she wasn't just another statistic. And now, she was one step closer to freedom. But she also knew this wasn't over yet. Judge Calloway still had to make his ruling. And in the world of law, anything could happen. Judge Calloway's words still lingered in the charged silence of the courtroom. "I assumed you were just a kid out of her depth," he admitted. "I was wrong." Olivia Carter didn't respond immediately. She let his words settle, let them echo through the chamber, let every person in that room, especially Michael Sterling, absorb the weight of them. Then, with quiet certainty, she said, "Thank you, Your Honor." For the first time since the hearing began, the judge looked almost human. The rigid authority softened, replaced by something resembling genuine reflection. But the moment passed quickly. He cleared his throat, straightened in his seat, and steeled himself once more. "The court must now determine the next steps," he announced, returning to form. "Miss Carter has effectively dismantled the prosecution's case. The key evidence is inadmissible, leaving the charges standing on shaky ground." Sterling sat motionless, his face unreadable. His loss was undeniable, but surrendering outright was not in his nature. "I move for dismissal of all charges," Olivia said, her voice steady. "Without credible evidence, there is no basis for this trial to continue." A murmur swept through the gallery. Judge Calloway laced his fingers together, studying her. Then, turning to the prosecution, he asked, "Mr. Sterling, do you have any remaining arguments?" For a moment, Sterling remained silent. The courtroom watched, waiting to see if the once confident prosecutor would attempt a final stand. Then, with a slow inhale, he rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured, "while the defendant has raised legitimate concerns, I believe it would be premature to dismiss the case outright." Olivia's gaze didn't waver. She had anticipated this. Sterling continued, "Even if the current evidence is flawed, it does not erase the fact that she was present at the scene." He turned, facing the judge directly. "The state reserves the right to reopen the investigation, gather new evidence, and refile charges if necessary." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Olivia exhaled slowly. Judge Calloway frowned. "So you're saying that despite the failures in your case, you want to keep this young woman under scrutiny?" Sterling straightened his tie, regaining some of his composure. "I'm saying the prosecution must ensure justice is served." "Justice?" Olivia's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stepped forward. "You're not seeking justice, Mr. Sterling. You're saving face." Sterling's eyes darkened. "Excuse me?" Olivia didn't flinch. If this was truly about justice, you would accept that this case was built on a faulty foundation, she said, voice firm. Instead, you want to keep the door open, just in case you can find something to justify the damage you've already done. A flicker of something, anger, frustration, maybe even guilt, passed over Sterling's face, but he masked it quickly. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose, tapping a finger against his desk. Mr. Sterling, he said, his tone cool. You are within your rights to continue an investigation, but this case as it stands does not hold water. He turned to Olivia. And as for you, Miss Carter, the room tensed. You have done something remarkable today. A beat passed. I find that the prosecution has failed to provide sufficient evidence to proceed. His gaze swept the courtroom before returning to Olivia. The charges against you are hereby dismissed. The gavel struck. For a second, there was nothing. Then, chaos. Reporters surged toward the doors, rushing to file their stories. Spectators whispered furiously among themselves. Olivia stood motionless at her table, processing the words that had just changed her life. Sterling was already gathering his papers, his movements stiff, his expression unreadable. Judge Calloway stood, stepping down from the bench. As he passed Olivia, he paused. You're going to be dangerous someday, he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. She lifted her chin. I already am. A hint of a smirk crossed the judge's lips before he turned and exited the courtroom. The moment he was gone, Olivia exhaled. The wait, the battle, the relentless fight, it was over, or at least this part of it was. She turned, gathering her papers, when a familiar voice made her pause. You should have lost. She glanced up. Sterling stood at the prosecution's table, and staring at her with something almost resembling admiration beneath the frustration. You should have lost, he repeated. But you didn't. Olivia gave a small, knowing smile. That's because you underestimated me. He studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The tension in her chest finally released. She picked up her files and turned toward the exit. As she stepped into the corridor, she was immediately met with flashing cameras, reporters shouting her name, microphones thrust toward her face. She wasn't just Olivia Carter anymore. She was the girl who had defied the system, and the world was watching. The cameras flashed, reporters shouting over one another as Olivia Carter stepped onto the courthouse steps. Miss Carter, how does it feel to win? Do you have a statement? What's next for you? She paused, the weight of the moment pressing against her. Just hours ago, she had been on trial, fighting for her freedom. Now, she stood victorious, not just as a defendant, but as someone who had forced an entire system to acknowledge her. She turned to face the crowd, her voice steady. There's no secret to what happened today, she said. The law isn't meant to serve just a select few. It's meant for everyone. But too often, people like me, young, underestimated, are told we don't belong in spaces like this. A hush fell over the reporters, pens frozen mid-scribble. Today wasn't just about clearing my name, she continued. It was about proving that intelligence, determination, and the right to a fair trial don't come with an age limit. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Someone clapped. Another nodded. Olivia didn't wait for more questions. She turned and walked away, her head held high, pushing through the sea of cameras and onlookers. As she reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, a familiar voice stopped her. Olivia. She turned. Judge Calloway stood a few feet away, watching her with an unreadable expression. You're going to go far, he said. I hope you use that mind of yours wisely. Olivia studied him for a long moment before nodding. I intend to. The judge gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before walking back inside. With one last glance at the courthouse, Olivia stepped forward, leaving it all behind. She wasn't just the girl who had won her case. She was the girl who had changed the game. And this was only the beginning. Olivia Carter's story isn't just about winning a case. It's about challenging perceptions, breaking barriers, and proving that intelligence and determination know no age. She walked into that courtroom as an underestimated teenager, but she walked out as a symbol of resilience and justice. This story reminds us of an important lesson. Never let others define your limits. Whether it's in school, at work, or in life, there will always be people who doubt you, who assume you're not capable. But the truth is, the only person who can decide what you're capable of is you. Now, let's talk. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you prove people wrong? Do you think the justice system truly gives everyone a fair chance? If you were in Olivia's position, what would you have done differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. See you in the next one.